First off, before I start, Beth, if you can make a note that next year, don't let me schedule myself after Kim. I kind of knew that would happen. And also before I start, I just want to share a little something with you guys that it's been incredibly encouraging to me over the last few days. Just, that all of you care enough about this, to want to be here, to want to support one another. I've been getting around to some of the different breakouts and presentations, and the excellence with which people are talking about and doing the work of this ministry is just, it's incredibly encouraging. And so, yesterday, like when, Delnor was singing the thankful song, I just felt very thankful that God lets me be a part of this. And this has been very helpful to me this weekend. For those of you who follow our ministry, I haven't been nearly as visible, over the last few years as, what I had been before. I'd gotten very burned out, very frustrated, very angry. The work that I do as a child psychiatrist, some of the things that I've had to listen to, some of the things that, some of the tasks that I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's been really, really tiring and really frustrating. And it's probably indicative of a spiritual problem when you start screaming ungodly things into the CVS voicemail. But, yeah, let's just say, we said a few things that were unbecoming an elder of the church. And so one conclusion I've come to with the help of a trusted friend and ministry coach is that I need to accelerate the process of retiring from medicine to ministry, for the sake of my spiritual well-being and for the sake of my own witness. And with that said, I have come to recognize that a lot of the stuff that I'm angry about, may in fact be a type of holy discontent that my ministry coach had suggested that I consider how the stuff that I see going on in medicine and the stuff that I see going on in the lives of the families that my practice serves, how does that stuff impact the ministry Key Ministry does? How does that impact the ministry that all of you do? For the most part, I've loved being a doc for the last 37 years. I've been a clinician, dabbled in some research that helped a lot of families, and in my job as a med school professor, I think I get to teach what's our most important class, which is evidence-based medicine. Understanding how to interpret and apply the research, to the individuals and families that everybody serves. I've had guys ask before, how do you reconcile your faith, with being a physician, scientist, child psychiatrist? And that's never been a problem because the common thread between all of that is that it's all about the pursuit of truth. Jesus refers to himself as the way, the truth, and the life. And so when we pursue truth, inevitably that's going to lead us to Christ. Historically, one of the things I loved about being a doc is that we were into pursuing truth. Even though most of the guys who do what I do are not of my faith background, we would vigorously argue stuff. We debate, but in the process of pursuing the truth, the end goal is that we'd all get to a collective understanding in terms of how to better take care of the patients who are in our care. It's not that way anymore. There's stuff we can't talk about, and I find myself increasingly angry, embarrassed, and ashamed by what's become of my profession. The pursuit of truth that historically characterized medicine is taking a back seat to an embrace of an anti-culture within our large healthcare institutions, our professional societies, and our medical schools that's characterized by this unquestioning affirmation of expressive individualism and radical self-determination. Identity is substantially based upon somebody's sexual preferences and their own subjective internal sense of gender. And we think about this, all in the context of systems of oppression that are rooted in Western culture. The antipathy toward Western culture in our profession, to be honest, I think is antipathy to the Christianity that's foundational to Western culture. And the anti-culture, it's a rejection of the idea that our identity as humans is that of embodied beings created in the image of God, a rejection of the natural law. I don't usually do this, but I got a lot of stuff to say, and I want to say it right. A rejection of the natural law, that the Apostle Paul talked about in terms of being self-evident, and that it's also, it's that sense in the natural law and the creative order that gives all of us the opportunity or allows us to understand what's right or wrong, even if we fail to acknowledge God. And the anti-culture is basically a rejection of the created order and a rejection of the Creator himself. And so my profession of medicine, it's at the forefront of a movement that increasingly seeks to pervert God's created order, confusing kids about what it means to be male or female, distorting marriage, usurping the family structure that's been established from the time of creation, the God-given structure that's foundational to our civilization, and the model for being able to raise healthy kids, twisting language in ways that words lose their meaning, killing preborn children as reproductive health care. We have pregnant people instead of pregnant women. I was at the top of my med school class, but I don't remember anything about men menstruating. We have a word to describe what it means to twist and distort the creation that God described as good. We don't use it real often, but I think it's appropriate here. And what we're dealing with in the world nowadays, and what I see, is evil. In Ephesians 4:26, the Apostle Paul encourages us to be angry and not sin. Implies that anger is a normal human condition that's not sinful when we deal with it appropriately. In the very next chapter, Ephesians 5:11, he tells us, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. And then at the end of Romans 12, he talks about, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so I've been wrestling a lot with what that looks like for however long I continue to serve in medicine and for the work that we do through Key Ministry. And I've been really angry at myself and disappointed in myself for, I guess, my failure to not confront some of the practices in my field that are just flat out wrong. So what makes each of you angry in a way that compels you to overcome evil with good? I'd guess if you're here this weekend, you're angry when you see kids with disabilities or people with disabilities or the disabilities themselves get in the way of those individuals and families coming to know Christ, serving and being served through the ministry of a local church. How are you called to overcome evil with good where God has placed you? And do you have the courage to actually do something about it? The Christian church first gained influence in the Roman culture, first, second, and third centuries, because of the love and concern that individual Christians demonstrated for the most vulnerable people in that society. The folks who preceded us in the faith, they adopted the kids who were abandoned or unwanted because of illness or disability. Their courage was on display when they stayed behind in the cities to take care of the sick during the pandemics at that time that would routinely wipe out a big chunk of the population. Those values were actually foundational to the creation and establishment of our healthcare system in America. And much of our healthcare system was established by Christians, Christian institutions, Christian denominations. And so one of the things that our disability community is going to be confronting very quickly in America is that the reality is that our healthcare system and our medical community is no longer engaged exclusively in the idea of preserving life, but in ending life. So last month, I got a call from a staff member with Christian Medical Dental Association. They were looking for physicians who could testify in state hearings in the Northeast about the fact that college age young adults probably shouldn't have the ability or the right to demand that their doctors kill them because of some sort of an illness or a disability, because, the prefrontal cortex, the higher order processes in your brain, don't fully develop until you're in your mid-20s. And so if any of you had a chance to sort of check out like our really cool baptistry across the street, if you were to go to the other side of the baptistry, physician-assisted suicide is now the 6th leading cause of death in Canada. They have temporarily put on hold plans to expand physician-assisted suicide to persons with primary mental health conditions and to quote-unquote mature minors. The College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario has declared that refusing to provide an effective referral to a willing colleague if a physician is unwilling to kill a patient who meets the criteria for what they call medical assistance in dying is an ethical violation that is cause for taking away that physician's or justifying taking away their license. And it is killing. 99% of the cases in Canada of medical assistance in dying, it was the physician or medical practitioner who personally administered the lethal dose of medicine. They have a debate going on right now in Canada about, expanding like the right to suicide to kids. There was a pediatrician from the College of Physicians and Surgeons who recently argued that parents should have the right to request their child's physician to administer lethal doses of medicines to infants up to the age of 1 born with quote-unquote severe malformations, grave and serious illnesses, or infants who quote-unquote perspective of survival is null, so to speak. Increasingly, there are reports coming out of Canada about people with disabilities seeking out physician-assisted suicide because of difficulty accessing necessary healthcare services, appropriate housing, appropriate support. In some instances, healthcare professionals are reportedly suggesting suicide as an option to their patients to relieve them from their suffering. We in the US are 5 to 7 years behind Canada in terms of implementing this. There are 10 states that have physician-assisted suicide laws now. There are 10 other states where this is in front of the legislature. The medical ethicist, Dr. Farr Curlin, has talked about this notion that the way that we think about things ethically in medicine has shifted. And he talks about the notion of a provider of services model. And in this model, patient autonomy is paramount, and physicians are expected to support patients' decisions, as long as they're legal and technologically feasible. So in this model, like a physician's conscientious objection to a procedure that a patient desires, in their view, violates the very aim of the medical profession. Patients have the right to choose the services that they believe contribute to their well-being, and the physicians are obligated to accommodate those choices, even when those choices are in conflict with the physician's conflict or conscience or ethics. Here in Ohio, we're lucky. I wouldn't be saying some of the things I'm going to say in a few minutes if it wasn't for our legislature, but we have a right of conscience law here that says that professionals can't lose their licenses for refusing to participate in treatments that violate their religious beliefs. What I found most unsettling was that the folks who were leading the lobbying in opposition to this were the Ohio State Medical Association, the Ohio Association of Family Physicians, and the Ohio Hospital Association. One of the other things that bothers me a lot is that what I see in medicine now is that there's this propensity, whether this is true or not, for our medical societies, our professional associations to claim that their cause of the moment is evidence-based, even when the evidence basis is basically limited or non-existent. I mean, who can forget our public health officials a few years ago who boldly asserted that the dangers of COVID necessitated closing our schools and our churches, but if you want to go out and protest in support of the causes they embrace, that was worth the risk. Or the church out west that moved their worship services to a casino in a state where casinos were open and churches were closed. When the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, my professional society, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, issued this statement. To ensure the healthy physical, mental, and developmental health of children and adolescents, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry recommends ensuring children and adolescents have access to quote-unquote evidence-based reproductive health services, including abortion. I'm convinced that when they make these statements, it's done with the assumption that no one with the ability to call them out on their falsehoods would ever possibly disagree with them. So I couldn't sleep after seeing that email, and I was up at night. I did a literature search of the National Library of Medicine. There is no evidence that abortion has mental health benefits for adolescents, and the more appropriate question when you look at the stuff that's out there is the extent of psychological harm that's experienced by teens who go through the procedure. And the most conspicuous misuse of this evidence-based term is the claims the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Endocrine Society about interventions that they describe as gender-affirming care. The British Health Service shut down their nation's gender medicine clinic after a comprehensive review of the research caused them to conclude that the evidence on the appropriate management of children and young people with gender incongruence and dysphoria is inconclusive both nationally and internationally. Finland and Sweden have done the same. So you probably wonder, why are we talking about this at a disability conference? The scandal that nobody's talking about that involves disability is the vulnerability of kids with pre-existing medical conditions and autism and other developmental disabilities to this gender ideology. So when the British government shut down the Tavistock Centre, which was the London clinic that cared for kids across the UK with these issues, 35% of the kids that they had treated had been diagnosed with moderate to severe autism. And kids with autism were overrepresented 17 times greater than the share of the population that they occupied at the time that clinic was shut down. A couple months ago, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table. I don't have an office anymore. I do all video visits and house calls. And so I'm sitting, in a family's kitchen. I see their two boys, and the younger one, is on the high end of the autism spectrum and has had a lot of issues with social anxiety. So the parents were thrilled. He finally finds a peer group at school and some kids to sit and talk with at lunch. Except that every kid in his new circle of friends is a girl who thinks they're a boy, and the lunchtime conversations now center on how they can all get together and persuade their parents to take them to the gender clinic at Akron Children's Hospital to be able to get hormones and to live authentically as someone of the opposite gender. The families that I see, and probably 10 to 15% of my practice is folks who are on the high end of the autism spectrum. The fear on that mom's face as I'm talking to her kid and she realizes how entrenched that this belief quickly became, and the fear that I hear in the voices of the other families, parents of other kids I have who are high on the spectrum, it's hard. I sat through one lecture during my general psychiatry residence. I remember one lecture. I'm old now. That I sat through during my general psychiatry residency at the clinic in the late 1980s. The professor was talking about approaches to kids who were born with either abnormalities of sex-linked chromosomes or ambiguous genitalia. And the take-home point was that the worst thing you can do to a kid is to cause them to experience confusion over gender. This embrace of the gender revolution by our medical establishment, our academic institutions, is the ultimate gaslighting. If they, with the support of the media and our internet overlords, can convince the public that someone with male genitalia and a Y chromosome in every cell in their body is a female, there is no lie that they won't be able to propagate. And I've always taken it that part of my job as a psychiatrist is to promote healthy reality testing. Affirming this, the gender identity, it's antithetical to everything that I was taught. One of the things that we learn in terms of treating kids with psychosis is that, you don't affirm delusional thinking or thinking that's out of touch with reality. If a kid comes in and, and tells me that they think they're Jesus, I am not bowing down before them and calling them the Messiah. We don't tell kids with anorexia, yeah, we agree with you, you're too fat. We don't tell kids who have body dysmorphic disorder, oh, you'll be a lot happier after you go ahead and get the next plastic surgery. So what are we doing? My profession has literally shot its credibility to hell and violated a trust that won't be repaired for a very long time. Okay. So yeah, Beth's saying, get back on task. I don't know how Keon and I ended up in the same church. That's a God thing. So what do we do as a church, and what do we do as a disability ministry movement to lead the church when the caregivers and the institutions they depend upon, have rejected the Imago Dei? Our most effective witness to these folks in medicine, education, and academia is the love that we demonstrate through the way that we take care of the most vulnerable people in my society. The guys who are more likely to see the Bible as a tool of oppression versus a repository of faith, don't notice the things we say. They notice when the only place their patients can get respite care is our churches. They notice when, folks, when foster families take in kids with severe trauma, where no one else will take them in. They notice when people provide, opportunities for, young adults with, developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, to do meaningful work, and to have impactful community. Disability ministry is our most powerful and impactful witness to a hostile culture because it causes these folks to have to reconsider the assumptions they have about Christians and about Christianity and about Christ. And our ministry is basically a demonstration of the church acting in integrity with however much of the gospel these folks happen to be familiar with. You angry about the diminished influence of the church in our culture? Start or grow a disability ministry. Start a mental health ministry. Support the families who are caring for kids who've had severe trauma. Second, we need to embrace a cradle-to-grave pro-life ethos. If you look at these trends in Western culture around physician-administered suicide, folks with disabilities being unable to access medical care, appropriate housing, being offered death to obtain relief from their suffering, the church has demonstrated care and concern. When we got slammed, for the pro-life stuff, we opened, crisis pregnancy centers, to care for women with unplanned pregnancies. If your church is one of these 10 states where they're allowing this physician-assisted suicide, or the 10 that are thinking about it, you might want to start thinking about opening a crisis disability support center where folks who have the conditions that would qualify them for physician-assisted suicide can find the care, support, and hope that they need to get relief from their suffering. Now, you knew I was going to find a way, if you've been here before, to show this slide. And this is something we've talked about before where we describe the impact of disability on church attendance. And it's no surprise to anybody here that if you have a kid with autism, it's 84% less likely that you set foot in a church. But it's 73% for kids with depression, families of kids with depression, 55% oppositional defiant disorder, 45% anxiety disorders. And we're talking about 20% of the school-age population, 25% of the adults in the United States. So that we got to do a lot better as a church in terms of promoting mental health, because we know that when people have mental health struggles, they fall away from the church. I don't think it's a coincidence if you look at the data from the last few years that as rates of mental illness are increasing, rates of church attendance are decreasing. And again, I know that correlation is not causation, and we have some pretty good working hypotheses to explain the explosion of mental illness. We know that when kids are bombarded with information through their cell phones and social media apps, that contributes to increased rates of anxiety and depression. We know more people are socially isolated than they've ever been before. And part of why our society is in the situation that we're in is that in supporting autonomy and freedom and personal choice necessary to sustain the sexual revolution, we've embraced a moral relativism that requires us to kick aside the God-given guardrails regarding sexuality, gender, and marriage that we need to thrive. The breakdown of the traditional family structure is what's producing the epidemic of trauma. Trauma greatly increases the risk of mental illness, and folks with mental illness who've experienced trauma are a lot more difficult to treat. I mean, our kids are growing up in a toxic culture, and if they're going to make it through with their mental and emotional health, but far more importantly, if they're going to make it through with their faith, we need to create a counterculture where they're surrounded by peers who are raised with the same beliefs, by parents in relationship with other Christian parents who are committed to raising them with a biblical worldview that they can use to make sense of what the world's throwing at them. We need to create a counterculture, and the counterculture needs to be created around strong churches and strong Christian schools. Why should parents of kids with disabilities have to use public schools to get the specialized care and education support their kids need? Our Christian schools should represent the model that the public schools emulate. The next front, after we do the mental health inclusion piece with the disability ministry movement, needs to be inclusion in our Christian schools and in our Christian universities. And so finally, we need individual Christians who are going to demonstrate courage in the face of extraordinary pressure to conform, to defend the vulnerable when our medical and mental health professions have abandoned their moral compasses and acted at odds with their historic purposes. Most of my colleagues who are working in large institutions or academia know that speaking out against this stuff is career-ending. The medical profession has become the reflection of a culture that silences people with approaches or ideas that challenge those in positions of authority. I want to tell you about a colleague of mine. This is Dr. Alan Josephson. He's a child psychiatrist, built the department at University of Louisville. We met working on stuff for the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's annual conference. He was the head nationally of the psychiatry section at Christian Medical Dental Association. He's been unemployed for the last 5 years. He was fired by his university when he spoke at a conference in Washington advocating for conservative treatment and supportive therapy for kids with gender discordance. The Alliance Defending Freedom has his case and is representing him now as it continues to proceed through federal court. I mean, talking about this stuff's hard. A few years ago, one of our ministry volunteers who's in a position to do some very impactful public advocacy asked me to get involved in speaking out against some of the things that are going on in gender medicine. I came up with every excuse in the book to say no. I'm not an expert. I don't want our ministry to become a target for activists in the government. And for the last 3 years, I have been struggling with just my embarrassment and shame in terms of what I did with that. Because as Christians, our job description is to be witnesses to the truth and to care for the vulnerable. And kids with autism or kids with mental health conditions who latch onto gender as an explanation for the discomfort in their bodies, or the parents who are emotionally blackmailed into consenting to unproven treatments by these gender clinic staff with unsubstantiated claims that their children are going to kill themselves if they're denied access to those treatments, they qualify as vulnerable. I've been reaching out to some colleagues the last few weeks to see if they would be willing to publicly advocate on this stuff. Every one of them responded as I did a few years ago. So I want to publicly say a few things that need to be said by somebody in my profession with my background and experience. Somebody needs to go first, and my hope is that it will be easier for others to speak out if they know they're not alone. So first, children do better when they're raised in homes with a mother and a father who love one another, serve one another, sacrifice for one another, and are mutually committed for life to one another in marriage. Medical interventions that are intended to end human life do not constitute health care. No one is born in the wrong body, and pretending that someone is of the other sex when the DNA in every cell of their body says otherwise, it's a lie, and it represents a disservice to the child or the adult who's suffering. I've seen stuff in my practice over the last few years that make me, as an evangelical Presbyterian, wonder if this is what spiritual warfare looks like. And at the risk of sounding like somebody who ought to be talking to somebody like me, I really wonder if what cancel culture is about is canceling the gospel. It's no accident that you guys are here this weekend. God has put something upon your heart to minister to folks with disabilities. I hope he's given you all kinds of new resources and relationships, to do that work. Where's God calling you to be courageous? Where's he calling you to take some risks or to do some difficult or uncomfortable things to advance the kingdom? Is he wanting you to start a respite ministry? Is he wanting you to, develop, ministry to support, kids on the high end of the spectrum who need somewhere that they can find healthy friends? Are they wanting you to advocate before your local school board or hospital board or state legislature? Are they just looking for you to speak the truth in love and to encourage others to do the same? So I want all of us to leave here with the courage to do the uncomfortable things that the Holy Spirit nudges us to do, and to be present to support one another through the struggles. Our team at Key Ministry would be honored to come alongside you, and we are privileged to support you guys in any way you can. So I apologize to folks for running over, but there's just some stuff I had to say today. And I am going to let Beth, come up and tell you what we're doing next.